We just learned how to find all of the users inside of a collection within Mongo using Mongoose and using the find method of our model. Well, now that we've done that, it is a good idea for us to now learn how to find a single record, because that is something we will do a lot inside of our applications, is just finding a single record. And that is done for updating, deleting, and pulling that record for view inside of our UI, or in this case, our little Node app. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to comment out the find all users function. And we are going to go ahead and add a new function down here. I think our debug is still running. No, debugging is off. Okay, good. We're going to add a new function down here for testing. And so I'm going to copy this little test thing right here. And we're going to create ourselves a new function. And so this is going to be function find one user is what we're going to call it. And again, this is just a test function. And so we're going to say find one user, finding one user. And all of our test code is going to go in here. And we are going to call it, of course, once we have a stable connection. So we're going to do our find one user, execute that function. And that, of course, is going to execute all of our code in here. All right. So this is really, really simple and very similar to finding all users, because we are going to use a function on our model, just like this one, a method. And we are going to use the find by ID. And for that, we're going to need a user ID. So let user ID equal some user ID. Now the reason why we're going to start off with a user ID is because if we're inside of a single page application or a front end and we have a list of all users and the user clicks on that user's name or email and they want to see the entire set of information for that user, we may need to make a call to get that information. And usually the front end, we're going to have that user's unique ID, because that's how we reference a unique user. So for this test, we're going to need to go ahead and not pull that up. We're going to need to go ahead and pull up our compass. And inside of our compass, we already have some objects in here that we can manipulate or that we can begin to deal with. So let's go ahead and let's pull out this first one, which is just test at test. So I'm just going to go in here. I'm going to copy the unique ID from the database, and then I'm just going to go ahead and store it right here, just so that we can use it as we are working with our find single user or find by ID. Now, same pattern that we have used in the all users, we're going to go ahead and use the user object or our user model, and we're going to do a find by ID function. And for that, we just go ahead and we pass in the user ID. Now, we're going to do a callback function, which means, of course, we're going to use the air and the user. And we are doing an anonymous arrow function right here to handle that callback. And in here, just like we've done with all these others, we're going to want to go ahead and handle the error. So I'm just going to copy that code, comment that out, tab it in so it lines up. And then, of course, down here, we're just going to do a console.log, and we are going to log the user that we got back, just so we can see that it was successful. So with everything set up, we're just going to go ahead and execute in debug mode. And we should see down here in our debug console a model that was passed back, and it is our test at test, which is uniquely identified by this ID, which we can see is the same as the ID we have right here. So we have now successfully called back a user from the database. And of course, this is find one user using callback function. And as always, we want to go ahead and make sure we can see how to do this using a promise. So let's go ahead and do it again with a promise. So we follow the exact same thing we have down here, where we're going to pull the promise back. Now, because it is a find, that means it is still, we have to use the exec in order to get the promise back. So let's go ahead and we're just going to copy this code right. Whoa. Let's go back down. We're just going to go ahead and copy this promise code we got right here for the finding users. I'm going to paste it right here. Now we're going to uncomment it. And of course, we are going to be pulling a single user, right? So let's go ahead and identify that. So we are doing find one user using promises. And of course, we are using the find by ID method right here, not the regular find. And we are passing a user ID instead of a query object. So we'll go ahead and make those adjustments. And we should see that we've got a find promise, and we should see that it is of type promise. Now, if we get that successfully back, it should be a single user instead of a group of users. And now it looks like we've got it all set up with a promise. We handle the error case. We handle the case where we get the user back. We're using find by ID. We're passing the ID. And we should be good now. So if we run our debugger, we should see we get back a single model. And it is our test at test. And we see that the IDs match up. Excellent. So we'll go ahead and stop our debugger. Excellent. So that takes care of finding a single user using the unique ID. Another cool thing we can do, so I'm going to go ahead and copy my promise code, and then we're going to comment it out. We can also find one user and limit the fields or attributes, right? Returned. So if we look down here, we see that all of the fields were returned. We've got email, first name, we've got the ID, we've got the last name, middle name, password, and role. Well, let's say that we were pulling this user for display on the front end. We don't want to provide the password, nor do we want to provide the role, because that would, of course, put our user at risk. So we want to make sure we don't send that information across the internet, because that could be super bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this promise that we created, but as before, instead of executing that query, we're going to capture the query, and then we're going to modify that query. So let's do let find query equal, and then of course, when this gets called, this first part, like we talked about before, when it gets called, it returns a query object, and then we call .exec on a query object in order to get the promise back. But by doing this, now that we have the actual query, we can make modifications to it and make it a more complex query than just this simple find by ID. So now we can say find by ID, but we can limit the fields that come back by saying find query, and now we can say .select, and using select and passing it a string of space separated field names, we can limit which fields are passed back. So if we're doing this for the UI and we don't want to include the role, the password, and maybe we're fine with the email, first name, last name, and middle name to come back. So let's just exclude password and role. So let's start at the top, and we're going to say, yes, we want to select the email, we want the first underscore name, and we want the last underscore name, and I do believe we would like the middle underscore name. All right, so when we see this come back, we should see it have all the fields except for the role and the password. That way we're not exposing that to the World Wide Web. All right, so let's go ahead and run this in debug mode. And let's see what we get back. We got a model. And we get back email, first name, last name, middle name. Password is undefined. In other words, we didn't get that value back. And role is undefined. So now we're not exposing the user's password, and we are not exposing the user's role to the World Wide Web. And it's not being passed out there where people can see it. So we have now restricted that special content, that secure content, and we're only passing what we feel should be in that front end. So that is simply using a select on top of our find by ID query and identifying the exact fields that we want returned when this query is executed and the promise is fulfilled. Excellent. Let's go ahead and call that good when it comes to finding a single record, doing it by a event handler or a callback handler, callback function, using promises, and then limiting the fields that get returned by using the select